much fewer people were wiped out by the Spaniards, more people were wiped out by the virus. So in a way, I don't think uh, uh, complete sanitization of anything is actually a good thing. You will already see there are many factors which need to be explained in India. Despite the number of infections, our death toll is still relatively low, despite the fact that we have a very poor healthcare system. Countries which have had much better healthcare systems have had much higher death tolls for the same number of infected people. So even if one does not believe the statistics will be at least 50% correct. So I think these should be discussed actually.
Okay, so should I start now?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay. Yeah, we can start.
Okay,
Sir, should we start now?
okay. Welcome everybody. Welcome and good afternoon. On behalf of the School of Life Science and Biotechnology, Adamas University, I welcome you all, especially our honorable speaker, Professor P. Balaram, who was the former director of IIC Bangalore and second highest Indian awardee, Padma Bhushan. So I really grateful to you, sir, as you have agreed for this speech. And I also welcome all other dignitaries and our faculty members and also our beloved students in this 10th webinar series that is in life science in lockdown period. And today's topic is biology, chemistry, and the unity of nature. So I would ask Dr. Sansha Datta to say about something about our honorable speaker.
Thanks, Professor Chakraborty. Yeah, it's indeed a great privilege to welcome our honorable speaker, Professor Balram, in our 10th webinar. And he is the recipient of Padma Bhushan and twice prize. He is a renowned biochemist for his work on structure, conformation, and biological activities of designed peptides. Everyone know him by his name, but I will say in brief about him. Professor Balram obtained his BSc in 1967 from Pune University, MSc in 1969 from IIT Kanpur, and PhD in chemistry in 1972 from Carnegie Mellon University, USA. He worked as a research associate at Harvard University with Professor Woodward in the Department of Chemistry. On his return to India, he joined Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore in 1973, and he was promoted to professor rank in 1986. He has served as director of IIC Bangalore from 2005 to 2014. Presently, Professor Balram is an emeritus professor, Molecular Biophysics Unit, IISc, and DST YUS Chair Professor, NCBS, Bangalore. Professor Balram has delivered lectures extensively at different universities and institutes of the country and abroad. He has made significant contributions in the area of popularization of science and scientific policy. He is associated with many journals. He was the associate editor of journal like Current Science from January 95 to June 2013. He was also in the editorial board of several national and international journals like PNS and International Journal of Peptide and Protein Research, Indian Journal of Chemistry, and many more. Professor Balram applies an amalgamation of techniques to study the factors influencing the folding and conformations of designed peptides. His group has investigated peptide sequences playing key role in formation of secondary structural motifs such as helices, turns, shapes. He and his collaborator, the renowned collaborator, Professor Curl, pioneered the use of alpha-amino isobutyric acid to induce and weaken helicity and constrain peptide conformations. Professor Balaram, it's needless to say, he is a recipient of several awards like that one, the Padma Bhushan, the third highest civilian award in 2014, the INSA Medal for Young Scientists in 1997, UGC Career Award in 1979, UGC National Lecturer Bhatnagar Award in 1986, Alumni Award for Excellence in Research by IIC 1991, and TWAS Award in 1994, and many more. So, with this brief introduction, I invite Professor Balram to begin his lecture.
Okay, thank you, Shansha. I'm very pleased to be able to give this lecture uh, on the web. It's a very strange feeling to be giving a lecture where you're talking to your computer screen. But the subject that I'm going to talk to you about is I'm going to try and take you generally through the connections between chemistry and biology, and also to try and tell you a little bit about how our understanding of chemistry and biology really teaches us about the unity of nature. On the slide which I made to introduce this talk, you will see that there are two pictures. The two pictures are of the two men who erected the pillars which constitute the foundations of chemistry and biology. On the right of the slide, you have Charles Darwin. And you can see that in 1859, when his book appeared, Darwin really introduced the idea of natural selection as the determinant of biological evolution. 10 years later, the man on the left, Mendeleev, introduced the periodic table to the scientific literature. What Mendeleev was trying to do was to classify all the elements which were known at that time in the middle of the 19th century. Both these are over 150 years old. And you can ask, what was the nature of the science that was done by Darwin and Mendeleev? You will see that both men observed nature. They observed the world around them. Darwin observed nature in all its glory. Mendeleev observed all the materials that had been characterized at that time. And they both observed, and after observation, they did classification. Observation and classification is one of the ways of doing science, and this is how the foundations of chemistry and biology were really laid. I'll use this quote from Darwin. And what Darwin says in this quote, and it's a wonderful quote, he says there is grandeur in this view of life. He's talking about the ideas that he's had on natural selection, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. What is Darwin talking about? Darwin is looking at the diversity of life, it is the diversity of biology, and asking how could this diversity have arisen? Would there have been a few simple forms which began right at the beginning, and then slowly evolution has and variation and selection has now transformed them into these endless forms that we now see today. Darwin's ideas on the origin of life in the 1860s were just evolving. He wrote a letter to his friend in March of 1863, where he says, "It is mere rubbish thinking at present of the origin of life. One might as well think of the origin of matter." I'm going to deal with both of these a little bit, the origin of life and the origin of matter. Some years later, he thought about the problem a little bit more, and he imagined now, and he says, "But if, and oh, what a big if we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo more complex changes." He uses the word protein here, and the word protein here is used in a context which is unique, because at that time the chemical nature of proteins was not known. Emil Fischer had still not done his famous work on polypeptides. The connection between biology and chemistry really comes from biochemistry. And we might ask, when did biochemistry really, when was it born? Biochemistry was born when Buchner did his famous experiments in 1896, 1897. He did the experiments which established that you did not need yeast cells to cause fermentation. If you took an extract of those cells, the cells were now crushed up, and you just took a soluble extract, the cell-free extract would also carry out the process of fermentation. This meant there were chemicals, enzymes, proteins which were present, which could catalyze all the reactions necessary for fermentation to happen. This really was the starting point of biochemistry. But let's take a look at Mendeleev's periodic table, which people usually have hanging on the walls of all the chemistry labs. And nobody ever looks at the periodic table, not even the students who are studying chemistry usually. It's there on the wall. The elements that you need are the elements that are marked in green. Those are the elements of organic chemistry. Those are the elements of biochemistry. The elements which are marked in pink, sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, and the transition metals, these are the elements that are necessary for life. And using these elements, nature now has been able to put together remarkably complex systems. And therefore, we now need to ask the question, how do we connect now Darwin and Mendeleev? But I want to take you back and ask a question. How do the elements form? Where do the elements actually come from? We know that there are elements in the earth, and one of the industries in India which causes the maximum damage to the environment is the mining industry. We know that we can mine for the elements. We can get gold, silver, copper, many elements by simply mining, because they are there in the earth itself. But how was the earth formed? All these elements were originally formed in the stars, and there's no better treatment than what I referred to on the slide. I think if you have not read it, you must go back and read Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man. On YouTube, you will find many episodes because this appeared as a BBC series in 1973. But Bronowski is one of the most eloquent writers about what you might call the evolution of man. And he begins with the evolution of matter. And he says in all the stars, there are going on processes which build up the atoms, one by one into more complex structures. Matter itself evolves. He then adds, the word comes from Darwinian biology, but it is the word that changed physics in my lifetime. Evolution is a very important word, and I think at the very end of this talk, I'm going to talk very briefly about cultural evolution, and therefore you must keep the word evolution in your mind. But we will take just one element, carbon. How is carbon formed in the stars? Carbon is formed in the stars when there is a way collision of three helium-4 atoms. Because of the very high temperatures in the stars, these kinds of reactions can actually happen. They are actually nuclear reactions. But three helium-4s do not collide. Two helium-4s collide first to give you a unit of beryllium-8, which then collides short-lived. And that collides with another helium-4 to give you carbon-12. And then he says the beryllium really is there for maybe 1 millionth of a second. And he says every carbon atom in every living creature has been formed by such a wildly improbable collision. This tells us what science has so far taught us about the evolution of the elements, from the elements to molecules, and eventually from molecules to biology. Evolution, as I've already mentioned, is an important word. And a little less than 50 years ago, in a few years it will be 50, the famous evolutionist Dobzhansky wrote an article in the American Biology Teacher, and he said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Today, we do have a problem sometimes because politicians sometimes don't like what biological evolution tells us. He asks, does evolutionary doctrine clash with religious faith? It does not. It is a blunder to mistake the holy scriptures for elementary textbooks of astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology. Only if symbols are construed to mean, what they are not intended to mean, can there arise imaginary, insoluble conflicts. You must look at this statement very carefully. What this statement tells us is that there is really no conflict between religion and biological evolution. The ideas of Darwinian evolution now are here to stay. They may be modified, but they are here to stay. What about chemistry? I can't do better than to show you this slide, which is a slide which I have made from an article written by Arthur Kornberg about 25 years ago. In this article, he called chemistry the lingua franca of the medical and biological sciences. Today, if one wants to understand modern medicine and modern biology, it is most important to understand modern chemistry. I think one cannot overstate the importance of understanding chemistry. In fact, much of the problems in India with respect to both medical education and biological education stem from the poor training in chemistry which we impart at undergraduate level in these disciplines. So one must think about how important chemistry is. There's a difference between chemists on the one hand and biologists on the other, and they sometimes don't see eye to eye. But Kornberg said that this rift between the two cultures of chemistry and biology might derive from the apparently more right brain dominated character of biologists and the left brain dominated character of chemists. The two sides of the brain control different functions. The left contributes to analytical thought, to logic. The right contributes to intuition, creativity, to art, music, poetry. And therefore, you can see that if you're interested in both chemistry and biology, you must work right down the middle and you must be schizophrenic a little bit, sometimes thinking like a chemist and sometimes thinking like a biologist. What has chemistry done in all the years that it's been around? It's been around now for pretty close to be started maybe at the beginning of the 19th century or even in the later years of the 18th century. So chemistry has been around for a very long time. I don't know if you're giving a lecture in a lecture hall, you can look at the audience and judge who they are. But if you're giving a lecture to a computer screen, you don't know who is listening. Now, I don't know what the ages of the students are, but I suspect that most of them would have been very young in the year 2000. And therefore, they would not know anything about what the world was going through in the year 99, 2000. At that time, everybody was very excited because we were going to come to the end of an old century, a new century was going to be born, and a new millennium was going to be born. And every journal in science then began to reflect on the past century and the past millennium. So the journal Nature asked many people to write essays on what they considered was the most important scientific advance of the 20th century. If I were giving this lecture to you in an interactive mode, I would have asked you this question and asked you to name the most important advance of the 20th century. But one of the essays which I read, which has stayed in my mind, is this one by Václav Smil. He wrote an essay whose title was Detonator of the Population Explosion. And this appeared in 1999. And he says the world might be better off without Microsoft and CNN, and neither nuclear reactors nor space shuttles are critical to human well-being. But the world's population would not have grown from 1.6 billion to today's 6 billion without the Haber-Bosch process. We are now closer to 7 billion. And what is the Haber-Bosch process? The Haber-Bosch process is the process for making ammonia. Now, why is this the most important scientific advance of the 20th century? This is because once ammonia was made, urea was made. And once urea was made, agriculture had its first fertilizer, first modern chemical fertilizer. The result of this was agricultural production went up, famines decreased, and the first agricultural revolution of the 20th century, the fertilizer revolution, is really because of the Haber-Bosch process for the synthesis of ammonia. Nature, of course, in biology, fixes nitrogen, converts to ammonia with an enzyme. Very efficient process, but this is not a process which gives us ammonia in quantities that can then be easily used for fertilizing very large fields to feed ever-increasing populations. There's a second chemical which I thought I would show you, and that is DDT. Look at its structure on the top left, a very simple molecule. But DDT had an enormous impact on two disciplines, on medicine, because it was the first line of defense against mosquitoes and malaria. The second was agriculture, because it was the first line of defense against the insects which were responsible for destroying agricultural production. But DDT is also very important in another historical context. It is after DDT was widely sprayed that Rachel Carson wrote this book called Silent Spring, which appeared in 1962. This is the start of the environmental movement in the world. So the environmental movement now is going to celebrate its Diamond Jubilee in 2022. That is the appearance of the book by Rachel Carson. She says here, we are rightly appalled by the genetic effects of radiation. Why are we appalled by the genetic effects of radiation? That's because the atomic bombs were exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. In August this year, it will be 75 years since that happened. Then she says, how then can we be indifferent to the same effect in chemicals that we disseminate widely in our environment? And that's really the first shot of the ecological revolution. But the relationship between chemistry and biology is a very intimate one. It's a very intimate one because every biological organism, with the exception of human beings, communicates with other organisms by means of chemical signals. Bacteria, all kinds of other parasites, animals, all of them communicate with one another by means of secreted chemicals. Insects and plants, for instance, bacteria and plants, bacteria and insects. And therefore, we now have a new discipline which is arising called chemical ecology, which Tom Eisner, the founding father of the discipline, said very nicely that it is a product of a partnership between biologists and natural products chemists, united by a shared vision and empowered by complementary skills. This is a remarkable fusion of two disciplines to allow you to understand how chemical communication takes place in biology. But in order to understand the relationship between chemistry and biology, uh, biochemistry stands right at the center. We must understand it. I thought I would show you this slide by a very famous molecular biologist, Sidney Brenner, who again in the year 2000, in one of these essays, said this. He said, I once made the remark that two things disappeared in 1990. One was communism, the other was biochemistry, and that only one of these should be allowed to come back. Now, Bengal, of course, is a place where both communism and biochemistry flourished once upon a time. Now, of course, it may turn out that communism might really have disappeared. But I think biochemistry, where really which started in Kolkata, must in fact flourish once again. Because we do not have to resurrect biochemistry. It will flourish because it provides the only experimental basis for the causal understanding of biological mechanisms. So here is the case for biochemistry. Does simple chemistry and biochemistry help anybody? Today, for instance, we are often asked, what is the use of doing research? What has science actually done? Here's a very simple Nobel Prize. This Nobel Prize was given to Arturi Virtanen really for innovations in agricultural and nutritional chemistry, especially for his fodder preservation method. In the cold of Finland, in the years of the war, fodder which had been harvested had to be preserved. It could not be allowed to decay. And Virtanen found that decay was stopped if the pH was lowered to 4, which he did by adding sulfuric and hydrochloric acids. This later on became the method. Modern methods of conservation of fodder in the form of silage and hay were really developed. In fact, what this really needs is to have a pH where lactic acid producing bacteria grow and other kinds of bacteria which spoil the material are no longer allowed to grow. And this now again was a major advance in the field of nutrition. Let me for a moment look now at how biology has grown over the years. There are three pillars of modern biology. I've already shown you one of them, that is evolution. The other, of course, is genetics, which was erected by Mendel again in the middle of the 19th century. The connection between genetics and evolution is this. Genetics teaches us about the transmission of hereditary characteristics from generation to generation. But every generation is not identical to the previous generation. It is similar. Where does this variation come from? This variation comes from natural mutation and Darwinian selection. Selection is a very important term. But how are genetics and evolution connected? Genetics and evolution are connected by chemistry. What is this chemistry? This chemistry is the science of heredity. It's the chemistry of heredity. Oswald Avery in 1944 discovered that the pneumococcal transforming principle was deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA. Few years later, Watson and Crick established the double helical structure of DNA. Incidentally, Watson and Crick do not cite the Avery paper in their famous paper in Nature. But it's really Avery who established that DNA is the genetic material. What the double helix did was it showed you what is the copying mechanism. What is the mechanism of heredity, the chemical basis of heredity. In my state of Karnataka, there are two terms which I hear very frequently, information technology and biotechnology. Now you can ask, where did these terms come from? And it's interesting that the two dominant technologies of our times have their roots in fundamental science. Avery, of course, I've already mentioned. in the 1940s, he established that DNA is the genetic material. That is the foundational work for biology and for biotechnology. Claude Shannon, who actually began the field of information technology, he wrote this famous book called The Mathematical Theory of Communication in 1948. He also published a paper in the journal Science, which is really the first shot in the information technology revolution. His PhD thesis, written in 1940 at MIT, has a very interesting title. It says An Algebra for Theoretical Genetics. So you can see that even at that time, there was thinking about the units of information which are there in biology. Genetics deals with information, and the ideas of genetics and the ideas of information technology sometimes coincide. I want to show you now a chart which will be there in every biochemistry lecture hall. And just like the periodic table, this will hang on the wall, but nobody will look at it. Because if you look at it very closely, you will find that it's very complex. And it looks like a traffic map. And it is, in fact, a traffic map of where chemicals go in cells and how they transformed into one another. This is the metabolic chart. This is what keeps cells working. This really summarizes the biochemistry of the cell. But the biochemistry of the cell itself can be looked at in somewhat simpler terms. If you look, for example, at the simplified version of the metabolic chart, it shows you three metabolic pathways: glycolysis running down the middle, the citric acid cycle on your left, and oxidative phosphorylation on your right. All these three processes eventually contribute to producing energy for the cell. Energy is, in fact, the most important currency in biochemistry. It is with energy, the energy that you get from nutrition, that you intake into a cell, it is that energy which then allows the cell to multiply, it allows the cell to carry out its various functions. But I was told that this lecture was to students who had studied chemistry and students who would be studying biology. So I've just taken a simple example here. Every one of you has seen the red chili, and the molecule which gives you the spicy taste is capsaicin, whose chemical structure I have drawn. This acts on the taste receptors in your tongue and gives you that extremely spicy feeling. How is this molecule synthesized? This is what we would call a secondary metabolite, but it's obviously made in the plant. And the way it's made in the plant is what I show you on the left side of the slide. You don't have to read it, but you will see that there are some chemical structures, there are some arrows, and on each arrow, I have written a name. The name is the name of an enzyme which catalyzes the chemical transformation. By looking at this, you can see that you need many chemical steps catalyzed by many different enzymes in order to make this secondary metabolite. That means the biological organism is investing a huge amount of energy in actually doing all of this. This is like a factory, and it's making many, many chemicals by these complex processes. The enzymes that you see written across the arrow, I will read the first name, phenylalanine ammonia lyase. That's an enzyme, but it's a protein. It's a macromolecule. And in order to make macromolecules, we need to have information which is encoded in a gene. And therefore, you need a gene. And that gene has to be expressed in order to make this protein. The result is that metabolic biochemistry is extremely complex. Before I come back to this, I want to show you an example. This is an article that I read before the lockdown, and it's an article which says, "Does hurting make us human?" And the article is about this lady, the old lady who now is a very interesting patient. She doesn't feel any pain. And when the physicians discovered that she appeared to have an incapacity to feel pain, they also found that she also had a very limited emotional range. She never felt unhappy. Now, this is a wonderful situation. You don't feel physical pain and you don't feel emotional pain. So, in addition to her unusual emotional composition, Joanne Cameron is entirely sensitive to physical pain. That's what this article now says. How does this happen? What is the science behind it? The science behind it is just this, that in our brain, we make a molecule, and the molecule has an interesting name. It's called anandamide. And I'll come back to the name in a moment. Anandamide, which looks like the kind of name that you would have given if it had been produced in Kolkata, wasn't produced in Kolkata. It's actually produced in your brains, but identified in an Israeli laboratory. Anandamide is a chemical which is produced in the brain, which now binds at the same receptor as tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the active constituent of marijuana, bhang or hashish, with which people are very familiar. So many people smoke bhang, hashish, marijuana in order to feel good. But it turns out that the receptor to which marijuana binds in the brain is the receptor to which the endogenous ligand binds. This is an internal mechanism for modulating pain perception. There's a complex biosynthetic pathway to make anandamide, and there's a complex pathway to degrade anandamide. And this has all been found in recent years. This identification was done only last year. There I show you tetrahydrocannabinol, the active constituent of and anandamide, the endogenous ligand for the cannabinoid receptor at the bottom. They have no similarity in structure, very nevertheless, in some way, nature has found mimicry. This is just the paper in which they established the structure of anandamide. But I don't want to deal with technicalities. I only want to look for why do they call this. In an interview, Shulam, who actually did all this work over many decades, he was asked, why did you find a name like anandamide? This was coined from the Sanskrit word ananda, which means bliss, and from the chemical nature of the compound. He said, we looked for a Hebrew name. But as you may well be aware, Jews are not very happy. We have a lot of words for being down and so on, but not so many words for extreme joy. Now I think in a coronavirus infested world, we might have less and less cause to be happy, and we might reflect more and more on words which convey unhappiness. But when you go from a substrate to a product, in any biosynthetic process, you need an enzyme. And if you need an enzyme, you need a gene. And therefore, the organism needs to invest extraordinary metabolic energy in order to make small molecules. Francis Crick recognized this a very long time ago in 1958. He said it is at first sight paradoxical that it is probably easier for an organism to produce a new protein than to produce a new small molecule. And that's really true of secondary metabolites. There is nothing secondary about secondary metabolites. Today, when we look at genes, we know a great deal about the genetic composition of all organisms. The Human Genome Project was announced into completion in the year 2000. Today, of course, there are as many. At the time that I picked this slide up, there were 789 eukaryotic genomes which were now known. And there are websites now where genome size, protein counts across genomes, and this is going up very, very fast. You can see that there's an enormous explosion of biological information. But I really want to come quickly to the problem of evolution. What is the timetable of evolution? This article in Science, whose reference I've given, discusses this beautifully. How old is the Earth? The Earth, right there, we have maybe about 5.6 billion years old. That's when the Earth was formed. When did biological evolution really begin? possibly somewhere the first signs of biological evolution may have started somewhere at around 3.5 billion years ago in the Archaea. And so as you go from left to right, you can see we are moving along in time, and this is all in millions of years, which is why I use the word billion. We come along, go all the way to the bottom of the slide and see. You will see somewhere along the line dinosaurs have appeared, plants have appeared. Plants come relatively late. You begin to find microorganisms coming right up on top. You see multicellularity in eukaryotes around 1500. And then as you come along, you will find by the time human beings, Homo sapiens, come, we're very recent. We imagine that we are the most important, but we are extremely recent. And it's taken all this while to reach this point. What are the critical events in evolution? One of the critical events in evolution was what is called the Great Oxygenation event. When the atmosphere of Earth went from being completely deficient in oxygen to enriched in oxygen. And this happened when the first photosynthetic organisms began to evolve. Energy of sunlight could be trapped, and then carbon dioxide fixation began and oxygen began to be released. And this is the great oxygenation event. And after that, eukaryotes began to evolve rather quickly. So you can see the origin of eukaryotic evolution now. This dates back to about 1500 million years ago. When did chemicals come? Chemicals might have been formed on Earth very, very early. This is an experiment which was done by Stanley Miller in 1953. He took a flask, filled it with ammonia, methane, hydrogen, and steam, and passed a spark discharge through it, an electric discharge. He got a residue at the bottom in his flask and analyzed the residue by two-dimensional chromatography. And what you then see here is a set of spots, and these spots belong to the amino acids. This sample with which Miller demonstrated the formation of amino acids under primitive Earth conditions is called the origin of life experiment. Many years later, the same sample was reanalyzed with a modern method of mass spectrometry, and it was now found that there are over 200 chemicals that are now formed. Once chemicals are formed, then in Darwin's warm little pond, maybe the first cell could be formed. Bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, the tree of life that you see in biology textbooks, will have a last universal common ancestor. We don't know what this last universal common ancestor really was, but in today's literature, like in an article in Nature in January of 2020, there is a very interesting article on the isolation of an archaeon at the prokaryote-eukaryote interface. But you can see when we look at all these organisms, there is man. Man is relatively insignificant on the scale of biology and on the scale of both geological and biological evolution. What about prebiotic chemistry? One of the most important molecules in prebiotic chemistry is hydrogen cyanide, which is there in the interstellar atmosphere, which can be formed in the stars. And from hydrogen cyanide, you can see that with this simple chemistry, you are now being able to see adenine, guanine, hypoxanthine, and all now appearing. This is the chemical formation from HCN. So chemicals can also form from very simple precursors. Where did these chemicals come from on the Earth? They may have come from the comets. Two chemicals which could have come from a comet are formaldehyde and hydrogen cyanide. And if you have formaldehyde and hydrogen cyanide, this very recent paper which has appeared a few years ago in Nature Chemistry tells you that HCN is a versatile precursor for making all these molecules. If you have a little bit of light, some little bit of copper, and a little bit of hydrogen sulfide, all of which was there on Earth in the early days, then you can make a large number of molecules of biochemistry. So you can see biochemicals beginning to evolve, and eventually probably somewhere chemical evolution intersecting with biological evolution. Why is life the way it is? Nick Lane calls this the vital question. He says bacteria evolved into complex life just once in 4 billion years of life on Earth. And all complex life shares many strange properties, from sex to aging and death. If life evolved on other planets, would it be the same or completely different? This is a grand question which one might think about. But I want to very quickly now, before I run out of time, show you how long human beings are there. I've taken this from YouTube. There's nothing much to see here, except that this tells you the world as it was probably about 200,000 years ago. About 200,000 years ago, there were very few people. There were very few hominoids. Homo sapiens had not yet arrived. And you can see now all of them concentrated here on the eastern side of Africa. Slowly, by the time you come to 32,000 years ago, 34,000 to be precise, you begin to see the spread. You can see the gray now spreading in other directions. If you go a little bit further, if you come to the beginning of the current era, or what is called now the Common Era, if you come to this, which is 2,000 years ago now, you can see that the world is now quite heavily populated, and you can see that India and China now are quite advanced in many places in the Middle East. This is the last 2,000 years. So when in India we have many discussions of things which might have happened, we rarely ask the question, what happened 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago? Where were we? And it turns out that we would have all evolved from something that was very much simpler, something that was very much more primitive. There are books which have appeared which now argue that ancient DNA may rewrite the prehistory of India. And this is because we now have a new field of biological analysis, the ability to analyze DNA extracted from individuals who lived tens of thousands of years ago from fossils. So the fossil record is now going to teach us very much more about ourselves than we knew a few years ago. The ancient DNA analysis field is booming now. It's got 7,300 samples now, whereas in 2014, it hardly had any samples. So I think the field will go up more and more, and we will get more and more genetic analysis. But in coming to the end of my presentation, I want to show you this book. If you haven't seen the book, you should see it. If you've got the book and you haven't read it, you should read it. And this is written by a historian. And what I liked most in his book was his treatment of biology. Because sometimes when an outsider to the field treats biology, they treat it in the simplest possible way. He asks, what is the connection between history and biology? And he asks a very interesting question. When did biological evolution now give way to cultural evolution? He says the immense diversity of imagined realities that sapiens invented and the resulting diversity of behavior patterns are the main components of what we call cultures. Once cultures appeared, they never cease to change and develop, and these unstoppable alterations are what we call history. So there is a definite connection between history and biology. When did this happen? He argues that the cognitive revolution is accordingly the point when history declared its independence from biology. As long as Homo sapiens was only restricted to hunting and gathering, they were no different from the animals, and the same biological forces which operated on animals operated on them. It is with the invention of agriculture, which is with making people stationary, with the formation of societies, that cultures began to evolve. Because you need myths in order to keep people together. And it is these myths which now control existence even today. He says here, to understand the rise of Christianity or the French Revolution, it is not enough to comprehend the interactions of genes, hormones, and organisms. It is necessary to take into account the interaction of ideas, images, and fantasies as well. I'm reaching the end. Bronowski again in The Ascent of Man. He begins this chapter on cultural evolution by quoting Wordsworth, who says, "For nature to me was all in all." That is, to the poets at one time, biology was what they saw. And he says here, "Among the multitude of animals which scamper, fly, burrow, and swim around us, man is the only one who is not locked into his environment. His imagination, his reason, his emotional subtlety and toughness make it possible for him not to accept the environment but to change it. And that series of inventions by which man from age to age has remade his environment is a different kind of evolution, not biological, but cultural evolution. I call that brilliant sequence of cultural peaks the ascent of man." You can't say this better than Bronowski. He said it wonderfully well. Is there cultural evolution? Yes, there is. Cultural transmission is more complex than genetic transmission and may occur on shorter timescales, even within a single generation. And this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences actually discusses this issue. But I want to show you only one slide to ask a question. Can cultural evolution influence biological evolution? Because biological evolution happens much longer timescales. But there is one example. It's a very interesting example. For much of human history, we were not able to digest milk. This is because typically we were not biologically constituted to drink milk. We were constituted to hunt. And therefore, we did not produce the enzyme that digests lactose. We lacked the enzyme lactase. But once cattle were domesticated and dairying came along, a genetic mutation that enabled the production of the lactase enzyme in adulthood was strongly favored by selection. This picture that I show you is from the paper. You see these little circles with red and yellow. The red and yellow, in the red regions, you have the enzyme lactate, and therefore you don't have many people who are lactose intolerant. In the other regions, where the yellow is more and the red is less, you have lots of people who are lactate intolerant. Therefore, you can see as you move from Europe, where dairy farming began first, as you move downwards, southwards, more and more people are lactose intolerant. This tells you something that should influence public policy. It is not a good idea now to introduce dairying and milk products into regions of Africa or in other tribal regions where lactose intolerance may be widely prevalent. But this is an example of cultural practices, nutritional practices, which now influence biological evolution by selection. Finally, to come to the connection between chemistry and biology, I show you a picture here of the man who really introduced the third branch of the tree of life, archaea. Carl Roos found this class of organisms which were distinctly different. When he died, one of his admirers put up a tribute to him on the internet, which I found. And what he said was, he quoted from Pliny the Elder. He said, "Nature is to be found in her entirety, nowhere more than in her smallest features." I might paraphrase this to say that chemistry is to be found in her entirety, nowhere more than in nature's smallest creatures, that is, in the millions and millions of microorganisms that abound on Earth. Among them, of course, there are also the viruses about which I was asked a question just before I began this presentation. Lastly, why do I draw your attention to a disparate group of subjects? It is because the environment, climatic, social, and political, in which we live today, that is really the reason why I talk to you about this. Some reflection on the roles of chemistry and biology in shaping nature may allow us to introspect on the course of human history and attempt to understand why the world today is the way it is. For those of you who study science, remember one thing. Science is a deeply humbling subject, and I hope I have conveyed to you how any attempt to understand even the smallest of nature's creations can be deeply humbling. Today, as we seek to understand the coronavirus in all details and also ask a question whether there are future viral pandemics in store for us, we might well do think about how chemistry and biology shape viruses, and then how viruses, in fact, eventually shape the course of history. Thank you very much for listening. And on my very last slide, I would just like to acknowledge the two institutions in which I have worked and thought about these subjects, the Indian Institute of Science at the top left and the National Center for Biological Sciences at the bottom right, both of which have provided extremely conducive environments to be able to think about chemistry and biology. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this excellent talk. We have lots of questions, so I am putting those questions. We have one question, the first question from Dr. Kuntal Pan. How would you find your evolutionary journey as structural biologist from your 1979 Nature work on novel peptide structures to human hormone analysis from bone smell?
Uh, this is a question about me and not the the topic that I've covered. But I have to say this: I have never been completely a chemist, and I've never been completely a biologist. In my own institution, uh, I was never a member of the chemistry department, and the department in which I worked was which was always on the periphery of the biology division. So this gave me a great advantage of being able to read, think, and research whatever I like.
So also, can you comment on the synchrotron, the how when we Indian can have our own synchrotron? That's the thing.
As things stand, I don't see a synchrotron coming in India in the next decade or so. I don't think we're going to have it. The best chance that we had of getting a state of the art synchrotron was some years ago. We do have a synchrotron in Indore with the Department of Atomic Energy. It can do a fair amount of the work that is necessary for doing protein crystallography. But I think synchrotrons have moved over the years to very, very sophisticated versions elsewhere in the world. So I don't think we're going to get a synchrotron to match those which are there in Japan, Europe, Israel, or anywhere.
Hello, 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 hello. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, okay. Fine. So we have a question from a student, Parijat Roy. She is asking about the origin of life. How the theory is most, which theory is most appropriate? The theory of biogenesis or theory of abiogenesis?
See, the most plausible route to the origin of life would be formation of a primitive, more or less like what Darwin imagined, that somehow molecular aggregates forming, cell-like structures forming, and eventually the first cell emerging from the soup. There's been no experiment which actually says that this is true. There is a completely different view, which very controversial view, which has been put forward by the astrophysicist Fred Hoyle, in which he says life came to Earth by seeding from outer space. But this only transfers the problem of the evolution of the first cell to some other place in the universe. So that doesn't really take care of the uh, gulf between chemical and biological evolution. We don't know. That's all I can say. There is no good theory of how chemical evolution eventually merges into cellular evolution.
Okay, sir. Next question again from Saurabh Bhattacharya, a student of ours. How the simple chemical inorganic molecules got triggered to generate the complex organic molecules related to central dogma of life. The inorganic molecules getting converted to organic molecules and how it can be related to central dogma of life.
Actually, this distinction between inorganic and organic molecules is a somewhat artificial one when we consider the sort of elementary precursor molecules which may have been on Earth. Take the molecule hydrogen cyanide. Would you consider hydrogen cyanide as organic, or would you consider hydrogen cyanide as inorganic? You can ask a question, what's the definition?
Yeah.
Hydrogen cyanide has got carbon, hydrogen cyanide has got a hydrogen. What is it? Now, it turns out that we would rather not define it now. Both inorganic and organic chemists don't like hydrogen cyanide because it's poisonous. But we have many molecules like this, which, in fact, on early Earth, there were a lot of hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are there in Earth. We are all the time extracting hydrocarbons. So you can have molecules like methane already present. Now, if you take hydrogen, or if you take carbon dioxide, or if you take any of the other things which people like Miller had considered at that time, some of them you would consider inorganic, some of them you would consider organic.
Okay.
Both together. In fact, iron plays a very important role in theories of biochemical evolution because there's a lot of iron in the Earth's crust. Oxidation reduction reactions can happen with Fe2, Fe3 recycling. And this is critical because for chemical reactions, what do you need? You need to transfer electrons and remove electrons. And this can be very done if you have a redox couple, which is why on the slide which I showed you, you will find that that paper talks about a copper redox couple, Cu1 and Cu2.
So again, our next question from a student. How significant is the Asgard archaea in bridging the eukaryogenesis from primitive organisms?
Can you repeat it? I didn't hear it very clearly.
How significant is the Asgard archaea in bridging the eukaryogenesis from primitive organisms?
See, I don't know. You see, the evolution of, let's say, the first eukaryotic cell, most people believe that this is because of some kind of union between an archaea and a bacterium. Eventually, with the bacterium having got inside, slowly by reductive evolution, losing many properties, becoming the mitochondria. And so eukaryotic evolution theories, most of them are based on this kind of idea of a union of an archaeon and a bacterium. So this newly discovered archaea, which is there in the January 2020 paper, is one of the things which is being widely touted as possibly providing some clues. But I'm not an expert on that paper.
So, sir, another question is from Dr. Arindam Mitra. Could you please comment on how the process of chemical and biological evolution is influenced by global climate change?
I don't know, this is hard to say because what the people who argue for the very adverse effects of climate change, they will say that if you have more and more climate change and loss of biodiversity, we will actually head towards some kind of extinction events. We already have had extinction events. It's not very clear that recent extinction events are due to anthropogenic activity alone. There have been biological extinctions in the past. So climate change and connection to chemical and biological evolution, I don't think we can really say very much. It will affect the environment, it will affect biodiversity, all of that will be affected. What long-term impact that will have, I think it's hard to extrapolate at the moment.
Okay, sir. In this context, I have a question like how chemical and biological evolution connects to the cultural evolution.
Chemical and biological evolution don't connect to cultural evolution. Cultural evolution can sometimes, over long periods of time, influence a little bit of biological evolution. The lactase example which I gave is that, animals, we have a lot of discussion on this in India, so you must think about this. Think about animals which are born, they may suckle and drink mother's milk, the mammals. What happens to them afterwards? Do they drink milk afterwards? No, they don't. On the other hand, human beings drink milk throughout their lives because milk now is an essential component of human nutrition, and dairy products are an essential component of human nutrition. But this is cultural. But because this is cultural, if you're not able to digest these products, and this would have happened thousands of years ago, you are now selected out slowly. You will get many kinds of intestinal disorders and so on, and over a period of time, you lose this ability. Lactase persistence, because we have the gene for lactase. We had it when we were babies, but the gene for lactase now is shut off during the process of human development, during the process of animal development. Many genes are shut off during the process of development. One good example is the fetal hemoglobin. You make fetal hemoglobin as long as you're a fetus and a little bit after birth, but then that gene is shut off. This is why, for example, in thalassemia, when you have defective beta globin genes, you are not able to go back to fetal hemoglobin. It's no longer expressed. The developmental program takes care of this. So over very long periods of time, the lactase example is possible now to look because it's happened over maybe 20,000 years or so. Because that's around when dairy and domestication of cattle and other things began.
Okay.
Today, I can tell you that this is a cultural practice. Today, for example, when we venerate the cow, we venerate it as a cultural practice. It's not a biological necessity, no. Because 5,000 years ago, whoever was living here wasn't drinking.
Right. Yeah. So another question related to evolution. Humans are still evolving. Then in which direction evolution is taking place?
Evolution doesn't go any direction. It is only people who think about cultural evolution who think that in some way human beings are superior. Biology doesn't consider any organism as being superior to any other organism. All the organisms are there. They are best suited to the environment in which they are living. After all, we are not going to go and live in the hot springs. We are not suited to that environment. Whereas some bacteria will be suited to that environment. We aren't going to go and live in the sea. We are not suited. It is human beings who now change and control their environment. And you can see that human beings changing and controlling their environment hasn't necessarily done the environment any favors. It's probably done the environment a great deal of harm. And this is what the people who talk about climate change really are worried about. See, on these kinds of time scales, any of our experiences is meaningless. How can I say what will happen 10,000 years from now when I don't know what happened 10,000 years ago? Imagine we are there for 60, 70 years, 80. The Bible says 70, which I've already crossed. And what else is nothing? The grandness of biology must be appreciated by students. Everything else fades into insignificance. In fact, biology, the current coronavirus thing, think about it, has taught everybody a lesson. You can't underestimate a virus. No big politician can control a virus. They can only control us.
True. So we have another question from Dr. Khashnabish. Is the appendix becoming irrelevant today? Is also a cultural impact of change of food habits?
No, repeat it again. I had difficulty at the beginning.
Is the appendix becoming irrelevant today? Is also a cultural impact of change of food habits? Like appendix, it's kind of rudimentary organ. So
I have to say, I don't know the answer to this question. The appendix is a useless appendage now and often removed and thrown away. At what point in time it was useful and in human evolution, I do not know. I don't know the answer to this question, but you've asked me a very interesting question. I'll go and ask someone.
another question from Dr. Khashnabish is while the 1953 experiment created some proteins, after also 70 years, we have not been able to create a primitive life.
Create what?
1953, some proteins have been created. So after 70 years, we are not able to create primitive lives. Why we are not able to create primitive lives then?
We will not be able to create primitive life in the near future. For example, even the case where Craig Venter synthesized an entire viral genome, he still needs to experiment inside a host. He has to use biology now, even if he synthesizes the genome chemically. So we are not going to be able to go from chemicals to life in the next 60 years. This you shouldn't make predictions, but I won't be around, so I can. I don't think it will happen.
So I have a question like how can we see evolution in a philosophical point of view, in philosophical perspective, like philosophy of chemistry and philosophy of biology? That's
That you should ask someone from a philosophy department. One thing that people have great difficulty with the word evolution. Evolution seems to imply that you are improving constantly. But this is not the case. What is happening is that you are getting better and better adapted to live in the environment in which you find yourself. So evolution doesn't go in a straight line. It's not like meditation which might take you to a higher plane altogether. No. Evolution is a mundane thing.
so, sir, it's really a very insightful talk. I also want to just want you to leave a message from your side regarding the present situation.
But what can anybody say about the present situation? Because anybody's guess is as good as mine. Because locked up in your house, what can you say? You can only say something by reading the newspapers or reading the enormous amount that is there on the internet. But all I can say is that the coronavirus will pass. Maybe many people will suffer, uh, might hit any of us, but it will pass. But there are many other viruses, which I would call cultural viruses, which will not pass so quickly. And those are the ones I think which do far greater damage than what the coronavirus has actually done. You can imagine that if you go back and look at the history of the 20th century, more people have been killed by people than by any virus, not even the Spanish flu, which took maybe 1 million people. But look at the number of millions of people who have been killed otherwise. So I think we should learn to live with we need to respect biology, we need to respect the coronavirus and be a little less arrogant than what we are right now.
So thank you, sir. It's really a very insightful talk. Our students also put a lot of questions. Also, some are asking which books they should study related to these topics. You can suggest for them.
If my slides can be made available in some way to your students, that would be fine. Do you have you recorded it?
Yeah, it has been recorded. Yeah, it has been recorded.
If you have any difficulty, ask me. I will send the slides. All the references are there on the slides.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Okay, thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you.
So, really, I am thankful to you for giving us the valuable time. I will now hand over the session to Dr. Moumita Gangopadhyay to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Samsha Mata. Still, I feel the essence of your lecture, sir. It is a wonderful lecture, and for us, just like us beginners, uh, it is not simple lecture. It's a lesson how to prepare lecture, how to present lecture, and how to deliver lecture. Amazing, sir. So, in vote of thanks on behalf of School of Life Science and Biotechnology, I express my deep gratitude to Honorable Speaker, respected Professor Balaram, for sharing your valuable knowledge and giving your precious time for us in spite of your busy schedule. I would also like to express thanks to Associate Dean of the School of Life Science Biotechnology, all respected dignitaries present here, my fellow faculty colleagues for their constant support and their concern and their valuable suggestions. I am pleased to convey vote of thanks to our students, all of the attendees who have made this lecture a grand success. Finally, considering this medical emergency situation for this pandemic or COVID-19, I urge all of you stay safe and healthy. With these few words, I would like to transfer my session to Dr. Arindam Mitra. Please, sir, conclude the session.
Thank you, sir. It's really a very delightful, insightful, and motivating talk for the faculty members, the students, and all the participants here. And many of the biological processes that we know are basically guided by chemical interactions of signaling processes. So, which is why it's important to appreciate that the science cannot be put in a box, and there are many interactions between different subjects, which we call different, but they work hand in hand to create such many, human evolution, or even the evolution of life in general. And you have very nicely illustrated about the various processes of life, how it evolved over time, and particularly focusing on chemical and biological evolution. So we really thank you for this wonderful talk. And uh, also, you mentioned about the biochemistry strikes back from one paper by Sidney Brenner, and in that paper he mentioned about something about communism and biochemistry, and one of them should come back. And we are from Calcutta, and we hope a talk like this will definitely make biochemistry back, and it will encourage students and everyone, whoever is in this audience, to uh, to read and understand and explore more about this interface between biology and chemistry. Thank you so much, sir, for this delightful talk. We hope to hear from you if you visit our campus. It will be wonderful, because this is only a computer you have already mentioned. So it will be great if you have a chance to interact with you and all the students all together, all the other faculty members. It will be wonderful. We look forward to see you in our campus in the near future. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. So,
With that, we can conclude the session.
yeah, I guess we can do.
Hello. Okay, thank you, sir, for your enlightened talk and enrich and excellent lecture, sir. Already our Dr. Mitra has requested you to visit our campus, and I would also like to ask you to visit your campus. And also, I would like to thank all other dignitaries who has given their time and listen their lecture for this session. And I also like to thank our beloved student for this session. Now we will close this session. With the host.
Can it?
হ্যাঁ সংসাদী এন্ড করে দাও
In
We can end this.
হ্যাঁ এন্ড করে দাও